Good afternoon and good morning to those of you joining us on the other side of the world. You're all very welcome to the Cdp Ireland Network Supply Chain Event 2021. Delighted to have you along. My name is Brian O'Kennedy. We're the executive behind the Cdp Ireland Network in Ireland. I have a very exciting panel and speakers for you today. Essentially, we're going to, actually, there we go. It's just decided to not move forward on me, so bear with me for 1 second. There we go. Perfect. So we will do a little bit of housekeeping first. Then Gráinne McIver from Clearstream Solutions, my colleague, is going to take us through all you ever wanted to know about Scope 3 emissions. Very challenging, very topical subject for many of us at the moment. And then I'm delighted to have two of our colleagues from CDP in Europe. We have Olwen Smith, and Olwen is leading out the Science-Based Target Initiative for CDP in Europe. And we have Hugo Ernst-Jones. Again, Hugo has helped us before in terms of the CDP supply chain program, and Hugo is leading the CDP supply chain program in Europe. And then we have two practitioners who are very heavily involved in this topic at the moment. Delighted to have Des Ferris from Keelings, a household name in Ireland, Keelings Fruits. So delighted to have Des talk to us about his journey at Keelings in terms of Scope 3. And then we have Joseph Tabbitt, and Joseph is a Vice President of Circular Economy at Flex, and the circular economy has a huge role to play in the context of Scope 3 emissions. So I think it'll be a very exciting panel, and we look forward to hearing from you and your questions. Just a few housekeeping items. You are muted on the webinar, but please, we'd like to have your questions. So put your questions in the Zoom chat and we'll deal with them as we go along and in terms of the panel also. This session is being recorded and we will share the slides and the recording afterwards. So, and we have given you also for further help, if you have any questions about the CDP program or indeed the supply chain program, please feel free to contact any of the Clearstream team. For those of you who are not familiar with CDP, CDP is the world's leading platform and program for climate disclosure. So if you're in the business of looking at your own emissions and disclosing your own emissions, or indeed assessing your suppliers' emissions, the CDP is really the global leader in terms of platforms. So it runs the global disclosure system that allows companies and cities and regions to measure and disclose and manage their environmental impacts. We've traditionally been focused on the climate change impacts, but increasingly forests and water programs, which CDP also run, are also becoming much more popular. It is the most comprehensive database. So the data that people provide to CDP is provided to investors and to buyers so that they can assess the sustainability and the carbon in their supply chains and in their portfolios. And data is key. So providing good data access through CDP is one of the key tasks and services that CDP provides. Investors, purchasers, and policymakers use this data to make their decisions. We're often asked about where CDP sits in terms of the credibility. It is regularly rated by Rate the Raters as the top platform in terms of ESG sustainability ratings. So if you want to be seen to be doing the right thing, you need to be disclosing to CDP. Finally, the Cdp Ireland Network, very briefly, it is a loose organization. It's an informal network of committee and responders and investors who have come together to help each other to deal with all of the issues surrounding climate change. And we have regular events and we produce a report every year. So if you're interested, you can contact us at CDP or indeed contact CDP directly in terms of disclosing. We publish each year, as I said, in February, we publish a report of how Irish companies are doing. And I'm delighted to say that we're continuing to score better than the average in Europe. So we need to keep that up. And it's not just about disclosing emissions. It's a lot about disclosing climate strategies and how you're engaging with your suppliers, which is what we're here to talk about today. So enough of an introduction for me. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Gráinne McIver, who's going to talk to us a little bit, try and help demystify some of these issues around Scope 3. Grania.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Grania McIver. So I'm just going to be given a brief overview of Scope 3. So essentially, what is Scope 3, why is it important, and how do we measure it? So just to take it back to basics, so for an organizational footprint, emissions tend to fall into 3 different categories or scopes. So your Scope 1 emissions is all direct emissions from your own sites or your own assets. So think of maybe natural gas for heating, diesel for company vehicles. Your Scope 2 emissions then is any indirect emissions, maybe from electricity that you purchase, or maybe from district heating or the likes of that. And that's the minimum that you have to cover in order to say that you have a carbon footprint for your organization. But the other category then is Scope 3 emissions. So Scope 3 emissions are all other indirect emissions due to activities of the business. And it has quite a broad scope. So there's about 50 different categories in Scope 3, according to the GHG protocol. Not all of them are going to be relevant to every single company. And of the ones that are relevant, there's going to be some that are more material than others. But there's a lot in Scope 3. So you can see here about half of them are upstream and then about half of them are downstream. So I'm not going to go through every single category, but some of the common ones that companies might start off with is say business travel or business travel or waste emissions. Or one of the ones that's quite difficult for companies to tackle is purchase goods and services and capital goods. So all of those upstream emissions and embodied carbon emissions from the products that they purchase, the materials that they purchase. Scope 3 tends to be, for a lot of companies, the most material source of emissions for them. So the average ratio for a company is that Scope 3 emissions are going to be 5.5 times higher than their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And obviously that varies depending on what sector your organization is in. So if you're a fossil fuel electrical generator, obviously Scope 3 is going to be quite small in comparison to maybe a retailer where Scope 3, it can be, so you can see there, 10.9 times higher than your Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions. So it could be over 90% of your emissions is within Scope 3. But for a lot of companies, it is the most material source of their emissions. And just to show an example of that, so this is Apple's footprint. And if you look in here, so the emissions from their corporate facilities is only about 2% of their emissions overall. The rest of their emissions is all embedded within their product. So you see a huge portion of that, about 75% of it, is in their manufacturing. So all of that embodied carbon in their materials and processing of those materials, and then a large chunk as well in the product use. So the downstream emissions of maybe the electricity that their consumers are using when they operate the laptops from Apple. So a lot of the, most of the carbon within Apple is really embedded within their products. And then another quick example of this, so this one's a bit unusual, but this is Kpis' footprint. And you can see again, so about their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions of their offices and warehouses is only about 3% of their footprint. Most of their emissions falls within their Scope 3. So the upstream emissions from actually the farming of the materials and to making their product, but also a huge chunk of their emissions fall in their downstream emissions. So the electricity for their consumers to boil the kettle, essentially to make a cup of tea, that's where most of their footprint is. And that's quite an unusual one in terms of having such a large chunk of their emissions in their downstream emissions, which they maybe have a bit less control over, but we're going to discuss that a little bit later on as well, in terms of how to tackle that. So it's become best practice to include Scope 3 emissions within your carbon reduction targets for carbon reduction targets. And Owen's going to talk a little bit more later about how that feeds into the science-based targets and net zero targets. But just at a very high level for science-based targets, if Scope 3 is material for your business, so it's over 40%, you do have to have a Scope 3 target, and an even more maybe ambitious one for the net zero criteria that's coming out for them. But just to show an example of this, so this is Microsoft's carbon ambition to become carbon negative by 2030. And that orange line within that graph there, that's their Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions. But that blue bars in the graph there is essentially their Scope 3 emissions. So most of their footprint again is within their Scope 3, and they really have to drive that down in order to reach their carbon negative target. So a lot of that is going to be engaging with suppliers and helping them to decarbonize in order to reach their own goals, to reach their carbon negative by 2030. So how do you quantify Scope 3? It's so many things can fall within scope 3, and it's outside of a company's direct control. So it is a tough one to quantify, and there's a few methodologies out there. One of the most common ways to quantify it is with emission factors. So DEFRA has good emission factors for a lot of the scope 3 categories. You can also get information directly from your suppliers. So if your supplier is doing their own scope 1, scope 2 emissions, scope 3, they can give you, they can essentially allocate a portion of that to you, or maybe have their own product assessments and they can tell you how much carbon is embodied within the materials that you're purchasing. And there's a few programs out there on that. Again, Hugo's going to talk a bit about the CDP supply chain program that helps companies to engage with their suppliers to get that carbon data. Environmentally extended input-output models. So these essentially relate spend data to carbon data. And they're one of the most successful ways to measure carbon emissions, but they can be a bit less nuanced and accurate. And then life cycle analysis or life cycle assessment. So this is essentially measuring the emissions of a product from over its entire life cycle. So from when you're extracting the materials, processing it, manufacturing it, transporting it, up until it reaches its end of life, measuring the emissions over all of that. And this is becoming common enough for a lot of companies to do on a product level to be able to actually measure the impact that it's having. Scope 3 is really a journey for most companies. So not everyone straight out the gate is going to be able to measure everything within their scope 3 and tackle it all straight away. But just so P&G, for example, this is really good, I think, in just breaking down how they're coping with their scope 3 and all the different elements of it. So that green part there, what we control, that's their scope 1, scope 2, that's relatively straightforward. But then there's scope 3, they've almost separated out into 2 separate categories. So there's the one that they maybe have more control over, which is what we contribute. And this is their purchase goods and services and the upstream and their distribution. But then there's other downstream elements that is maybe a bit more difficult for them to tackle. So the use of their products, for example, the electricity around that. And it's not to say that they're not, they're including both of them within their carbon strategy, but they deal with them a bit separately. So the ones that they contribute, they measure them a lot more accurately. So they're able to get more accurate data from their suppliers on that. And they're able to make more ambitious and aggressive targets around it. But then the other elements, they still measure them, they still include them in it, but they recognize that it's more so something that they influence to reduce than maybe the other one. So you can separate out your scope 3 into these different ways, and you will build it over time in terms of how accurately you're measuring it and how you're dealing with all of it. So I won't go through these, but I just wanted to pop in a few useful resources. So standards, programs you can go into, databases, funding for companies as well. Yeah. Perfect. So I'm going to hand back now to. So
I just a quick question, Grania, before you do. There's a lot of activity at the moment around scope 3 screenings. A lot of companies are doing a screening exercise. What's that involved, and why are they doing this?
Yeah. So scope 3 screening is essentially it's where you take the 15 categories of scope 3 and essentially firstly go through, okay, what's relevant to our company, what's not relevant to our company. Of the ones that are relevant to our company, scope 3 screening is essentially trying to get some kind of number on it, and it doesn't have to be exact numbers. So some of those you're going to be able to get good data on, you're going to be able to get an accurate number. Some of them it might just be an extrapolated number, some kind of back of the envelope number, just to see what's material to the company and what's not material to the company, and where each category fits, just to get a first pass. And a lot of companies are doing it for their targets. So for science-based targets, you have to firstly assess if scope 3 is material enough for your business to set a scope 3 target. So it's kind of one of the first steps along that, just to see if it's material first, and then once you assess if it is material, you can kind of drill into it a bit more and create a pathway to get more accurate numbers and to create your targets around that. Okay,
and one of the things that we also get told, the companies are a little afraid of overextending their responsibility for scope 3 emissions, but I think that's not really something that we're too concerned about. In fact, we'd encourage companies to use as much, to treat it as a large field or a big canvas that they can engage with. Why might they look to try and include as much as possible in their scope 3 emissions reporting?
Yeah, you want to include as much as possible. You're never going to be penalized by the number of scope 3. So if you think, oh, okay, well, this is going to make our number look bigger, no one ever is going to point at the number. They're more so going to, it's more so going to reflect well that you're essentially trying to capture as much as possible, be as transparent as possible, and try and influence as much as possible. So I think that's the key word in scope 3. It's more so about what you can influence and trying to influence more,
Excellent. Thank you very much, Grania. And as I said, if you have further questions, please pop them in the chat box for our panelists and presenters. So now I'm going to hand over to Alwyn and Hugo at CDP. Alwyn, you should be able to share there. And Alwyn's going to take us through probably one of the big drivers of focus on scope 3, which is currently this drive towards companies setting science-based targets and net zero targets, and where scope 3 plays, the role of scope 3 in terms of that process. And then Hugo's going to talk to us about how CDP supply chain program can help us with that. So over to you, Alwyn.
Many thanks, Brian. Just quickly, can I check, can everyone see my screen correctly?
Yes, indeed.
Good, glad to hear. So yeah, many thanks, and thanks for the Cdp Ireland Network for inviting us here to speak today. To quickly introduce myself, I'm the regional lead for net zero campaigns at CDP, but I also sit within the Science-Based Targets Initiative's corporate engagement team. And as Brian said today, really happy to speak with you a bit about science-based targets themselves and the importance of scope 3 within them and on the journey to net zero. So firstly, just to provide a very quick background to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, for those of you which are less familiar, the SBTI was founded in 2015 as a collaboration between these 4 partner organizations, of which CDP is one, and the others are the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. And it was founded with the aim of driving ambitious climate action in the private sector, and it's actually been very successful, particularly the last few years, as you see the numbers on the right of the slide here illustrate that it's had really strong traction, and we're up at over 1,800 companies globally who are part of the initiative now, and that equates to close to 25% of global market capitalization. So it's really become the global standard in emissions reductions target setting. But moving on to explain briefly what science-based targets themselves are then. So a corporate emissions reduction target would be deemed to be science-based if it's in line with the level of decarbonisation that's required by the latest climate science, to be in line with ideally a 1.5 degree trajectory of warming. So basically what the SBTI has done and what it started to work on just before the Paris Agreement was translating these global goals into company level targets. So a science-based target now helps a company to determine how much and how fast they need to decarbonise to be in line with these temperature pathways. And one additional note then on the time frame of these near-term science-based targets, they are stepping stones, let's say, on the way to this longer term kind of North Star goal of net zero, which I'm going to discuss a bit more later on in my presentation. So looking then at how a company might go about joining the Science-Based Targets Initiative, there's a couple of routes in and a couple of different commitment models and options, but there's one that I really wanted to highlight specifically today, which is the Business Ambition for 1.5 Degree campaign. And so obviously it's become really clear in the last few years with the publication of the IPCC reports in late 2018 and then again this summer that we need to limit warming to within 1.5 degrees if we're going to avoid the really most catastrophic impacts of climate change. And that realization was what catalyzed then the creation of this campaign in June 2019. And it's really a call to action for companies when they're setting science-based targets to do so along this most ambitious trajectory. And interestingly, at the time in June 2019, this campaign was really seen as a leadership campaign, that setting a 1.5 degree target was this signifier of leadership, but now it's really become the new normal, which is great to see. So I think it's been quite successful in that regard. But just a few notes on the campaign itself. If as a company you're considering joining it, once you do join it, you're committing to set your target in line with this level of ambition, but you also then become part of the United Nations Race to Zero campaign, which is an umbrella campaign happening in the lead up to COP. And you're committing, interestingly, this is extra component at the last point on the slide, you're committing to having policy advocacy positions that are in line with the 1.5 degree future. And that's a really interesting point, I think, think because it's urging companies to advocate at key policy moments. So currently there's some letters circulating to Business Ambition campaign companies that are going to be addressed to the G20 summit leaders or leaders at COP. And it's really giving this strong signal to policymakers, which then creates a positive ambition loop. So this signal emboldens policymakers to ensure the policy environment is favourable for the kind of level of decarbonisation that this company has committed to. So I won't delve too much into this now, just in the interest of time, but this slide depicts the two commitment options a company has if they were to join this campaign. Very quickly to say the first option is more focused on a really high level of ambition in the short term. So a company is committing to setting a science-based target, this near-term science-based target that is 1.5 degree aligned across all three scopes. So that includes scope 3. And then the second option is about setting a long-term net zero target and also an interim science-based target. But what I'm going to delve more into now, given the topic of this session, is the SBTi scope 3 criteria. So as Grania laid out very, very well earlier on, scope 3 can be quite daunting and it's a tough nut to crack for many companies. And so with this in mind, the SBTi does give more flexibility in target setting on scope 3 when compared to scope 1 and 2 target setting requirements. So this flexibility comes in a couple of different ways. Firstly, as Grania mentioned, there's a threshold of 40%. So if a company scope 3 emissions do not constitute more than 40% of their total emissions, they don't need to set a science-based target on their scope 3. If they do, and actually most companies do fall into that bucket that it does cross that 40% threshold, then they will need to set a scope 3 target, but the target boundary only needs to be 2/3 of their scope 3 emissions. They can exclude up to 1/3 of the scope 3, and that could be based on, you know, as Grania was saying, which parts of the value chain they feel they have most influence over, where do they have the levers to pull and others less so they can exclude the parts that they think they won't be able to influence as strongly. And then the final way that there's this kind of added flexibility for scope 3 is on the types of target setting approaches that are allowed for scope 3. So this next slide here on the column on the right shows that there's a wider range of target setting approaches available. I would like to just point out that the last two slides I've shown are based on the SBTi's current criteria. We are updating the criteria, and from July 2022, a new criteria will come into force, version 5. And so that will slightly change these requirements. There will still be some more leniency on scope 3 target setting compared to scope 1 and 2, but the ambition is going to ratchet up overall. And just then to drill down into one of these target setting approaches a bit more, and particularly given in light of what Hugo is going to discuss after, the supplier engagement target on the last row here of this column is one way that companies can set their scope 3 target, or at least one of their scope 3 targets, because it's also acceptable to have multiple scope 3 targets under the SBTi's criteria, and actually many companies opt to do that. And so if a company was to select a supplier engagement target, they're really committing here to having a specific percentage of their suppliers by either spend or emissions to have set their own science-based targets within 5 years. So it's about a company using that power of procurement to cascade the action down their supply chain. The formulation of the target, as said, can be either by spend or emissions, and the time frame, as said, it's a bit shorter compared to the kind of regular science-based target time frame, and this is because we need those companies tier 1 suppliers to be setting their targets within 5 years, so that the emissions reductions are starting to take place within the necessary time frame. And one concrete example of such a supplier engagement target is Salesforce. So they set one which says that they commit to 60%, suppliers representing 60% of their scope 3 emissions, covering all upstream emissions categories, to have set their own science-based targets by 2024. They set that in 2019, so that's the 5-year window. And interestingly, Salesforce actually announced a few months ago that they will bring in a procurement requirement for their suppliers to have science-based targets. So it's a really powerful example of how they're going to use their influence as a big buyer to accelerate their own suppliers' climate ambitions. So conscious of time then, I'm just going to briefly mention the Science Based Targets Initiative's net zero standard. So over the past few years, I'm sure we're all very well aware that there's been this proliferation of net zero commitments and targets in the corporate landscape, but there is often quite a big divergence in these types of targets and the actual definition of net zero applied by each company. So that means that there isn't a global standard or benchmark that can be used. And so against the backdrop of this problem, the SBTi, due to its kind of role as a standard setter in near-term targets, is soon going to release the first ever global net zero corporate standard. So the hope is that this will provide a lot of much needed clarity and credibility to net zero claims amidst the kind of current confusion and accusations of greenwashing. And so there's been quite a lengthy and stakeholder inclusive process over the past year plus that the SBTi has been running to develop this standard. It's in its last stages, so there's a final public consultation ongoing at the moment that's running till October 6th. And then the launch of the standard will be October 28th, so just right before COP26. And then from January 2022, companies will actually start to be able to have their own net zero targets also validated by the SBTi. So very briefly then, just to touch on the key elements of this net zero standard. So the main focus of the standard is really going to be on decarbonisation. So really deep decarbonisation and across all scopes. So in light of this session, particularly scope 3 is going to become a bit more stringent compared to what I've gone through and explained how there's a bit more flexibility on scope 3 target setting today. That flexibility won't be in the long-term targets required under the net zero standard. So I won't go into too much detail on it here, but basically it's likely that under this long-term science-based target piece, most companies, it's slightly sector specific, but most companies will be required to have about a 90% absolute emission reduction across all scopes. And so, yeah, I think with that, I'll wrap things up. I'm conscious of time, but I did just also want to let you know that we have multiple resources on our website, huge amount of information there. So this deck will hopefully be circulated afterwards, and please feel free to review those and get in touch if you have any questions. Many thanks, and over to you, Hugo.
Super, thanks very much, Orwin. Good to meet you, everybody, and very happy to join today to represent the CDP supply chain program team during this call. Just to briefly reintroduce myself, I'm Hugo. I lead the supply chain program in Europe. We currently have around 50 or so multinational members that we work with, including several in Ireland, to engage with their suppliers on climate change, water security, and deforestation topics. So if we just move to the next slide, just an overview of the kind of numbers that we work with currently. We have over 200 members globally who are requesting their suppliers to respond to climate, water, and forest through the CDP supply chain program. And they represent around 5.5 trillion in procurement spend, requesting thousands of suppliers to share their data. And the way that this works is essentially the members provide a list of their key suppliers that they would like to access data from in order to track progress towards targets or get an overview of impacts across their supply chain. And then CDP then reaches out to those suppliers, asking them to disclose through our platform. And the suppliers only need to submit one response, and then we'll share that data with all their requesting stakeholders, including any investors that are also part of that request. And the theory of change behind CDP is really that by requesting this data from companies, it helps to drive positive change in two main ways. The first is that it facilitates effective action by the companies that are reporting. And secondly, it better informs decisions being made by their stakeholders and putting environmental data at the heart of any business decisions around investment and procurement. So if we move to the next slide, you can see here, Grania also covered this briefly earlier as well, that while companies tend to have a handle on how they're managing impacts in their operations, it's becoming more of a market expectation for corporations to take responsibility for their whole value chain's environmental impacts, which is why the science-based target criteria includes this focus on scope 3. And from the data that we've collected through CDP over the years, we found that emissions in the supply chain tend to be on average 11 times higher than a company's direct operational emissions from scope 1 and 2. And so this buyer-supplier interaction and dynamic is a really key one in order to help us make sure that we can meet the goals that we've set to reach net zero by 2050 as the science dictates. And the fact that global corporations have supply chains that kind of wrap around the world have this huge potential to drive climate action at scale using this procurement spend as a leverage tool to influence and collaborate with suppliers and incentivize behavior change that we need to see. At the same time, companies also recognize that there are opportunities in supply chains to reduce costs as a result of more efficient ways of operating. And we found last year that suppliers reported combined savings of $33 billion through actively cutting their emissions. And this was a 67% increase actually on the year before. So depending on the level of maturity that suppliers have, there may be some quick wins for them to make equipment upgrades or lighting upgrades that can immediately help to improve their performance and reduce their own costs. If you look at the next slide, we've pulled together some stats from Irish headquartered companies that responded to CDP in 2021. And these numbers are sort of fresh out of the system, and more to come, I'm sure, in the Cdp Ireland report. But you can see here that among responding companies, there's a pretty good coverage of scope 1 and 2 emissions, either location-based or market-based. But actually only around 50% of Irish headquartered companies responding to CDP this year reported their scope 3 emissions, specifically those that are coming from purchased goods and services in the supply chain. And this pattern is not uncommon due to the complexities around accessing scope 3 data, which by definition exists outside a company's direct control. But as we've heard, scope 3 is often where the larger proportion of emissions actually sit. So one of the things we help our members with in CDP supply chain program is to access that data on what those impacts actually are in the supply chain, interpret that, and then take steps to help reduce that with suppliers. And we also, on the next slide, took a quick look at target setting among Irish headquartered companies and found that 61% of Irish headquartered firms had an emissions reduction target, and that 79% of those companies were actually already reporting doing something to reduce emissions in line with their ambitions. But again, you can see that the number or percentage engaging with their suppliers still, substantial at 2/3. But again, much more opportunity there for companies within Ireland to actually actively be engaging with their suppliers to reduce their emissions. And typically, what we kind of we'd look at, if you on the next slide, as a sort of roadmap for supplier engagement, is a kind of iterative process, building a good foundation in terms of engagement with suppliers, and then building on that year after year. So the first really key thing we help members with is to decide which suppliers you want to engage with. So of course, don't have to engage with all of your many thousands of suppliers, but particularly picking out those in your tier 1 that you have a strategic relationship that represent a good proportion of your spend. Typically around 70% is a good starting point. And then engaging with those suppliers to begin with, ensuring that you have a good coverage of where your kind of key relationships are, but also likely impacts of where your emissions will be concentrated. The key next step then is also to set expectations with your suppliers about the types of KPIs you'll be monitoring and the behaviors that you need to see in order to help you meet your own target. And we'll take a look at some of these on the next slide in a second. But the really important next step then is actually reaching out and collecting the data. So finding a kind of consistent way to collect this data year on year is really important, so you can kind of track progress and see improvement against targets. Often, companies may not have the in-house resource in order to collect this data and reach out to suppliers individually. So that's where CDP Supply Chain helps members in that regard as well. And once that kind of system's been set up, communicating the KPIs internally and externally, and then benching suppliers' performance against those KPIs year on year, as well as feeding back to suppliers collectively or at an individual level, also helps to kind of trigger that improvement in performance over time. So if we move on to the next slide, actually selecting these KPIs is one of the biggest puzzles that we find our members have. But typically what we would recommend is starting off by identifying KPIs associated with disclosure and emissions data. So this is really the kind of baseline or the foundation for everything that comes after that. Really want to sort of understand what the current impacts are from those suppliers, and then look at that year-on-year improvement over time. Intermediate KPIs are more action focused. So this would be asking your suppliers to set targets themselves and implement initiatives in order to reach those targets. So switching to renewables, for example, is a good first step. And then themselves, over time, starting to engage with their own suppliers to reduce emissions. So we actually want suppliers themselves to be asking their suppliers to be setting net zero targets or 1.5 degree scenarios in order to cascade that level of engagement throughout the supply chain. And many members will also have internal KPIs that they'll be monitoring. So they'll, for example, look at what percentage of their suppliers responded to the request for information for that year, how many have got targets, etc. So they are also, those that are running the program are kind of mapping their own performance from an engagement perspective year on year as well. If we look on the next slide, just an overview of the types of data outputs that we typically provide to members to help them do this kind of number crunching and interpretation of the data. But we provide raw data outputs with all of the answers to all of the questions reported by suppliers through the CDP supply chain program, as well as some more analytic outputs that provide a kind of visual benchmark about suppliers' performance for that member against peers or the overall supply chain program itself. And many members are using this program specifically to work towards their science-based targets, which you can see on the next slide. In particular, using the CDP request for information as a communication channel through which to talk to suppliers about the SBTs that they've set and the expectations that they have of their suppliers themselves to set targets and reduce emissions over time. We also had an exciting new development this year, which was that CDP supply chain members for the first time were added to a number of letters sent to high impact companies asking them to commit to and set science-based targets on behalf of 220 financial institutions. So we're starting to actually combine the investor demand for companies to set SBTs alongside supply chain members. So they're sort of speaking with one voice, as it were. And the CDP questionnaire also provides a best-in-class framework for suppliers to use in order to set their own environmental strategies and take those steps towards setting science-based targets. And finally, can be used by members to identify which of those really key suppliers that represent the bulk of Scope 3 emissions from the supply chain that really need to take action in order to enable the member to meet their own science-based targets. It could be that a small handful make a really big difference, and looking at what level of maturity those suppliers are at, what support they might need, helps members to kind of tailor capacity building also to work with those suppliers on a one-on-one basis. So I'll leave it there and hand back over to Brian.
Hugo, thank you very much, and indeed to Alwyn. I think based on the registrations, we had over 200 people registered for today's webinar. The topic is of huge interest, and I think Alwyn, the declutterizing or mystifying the science-based target initiative was really, really useful for a lot of people. So I think there are two big initiatives that we're seeing a big focus on Scope 3 measurement, and I think CDP has a really positive role to play in helping companies to do that without if they're not minded to do it all themselves directly with their suppliers. So thank you both very much, and thanks for your continued support for the program in Ireland. And please hang on, I'm sure more questions that you might be able to answer. So keep the questions coming in, some great questions. Delighted now to move to the panel section, which typically is the one that gets people excited. We're delighted to have Des Ferris from Keelings and Joseph Tabbitt from Flex. Gentlemen, you're both very welcome. Two very different businesses, and I think we're almost looking at Des, you're more on the buyer side, and Joseph, maybe you're more on the supplier side, helping your clients. But maybe just before we get into your Scope 3 journeys and what you're doing for either your customers or your suppliers around Scope 3, maybe just to get a perspective on your role in your organization and the role that sustainability plays. So maybe Des, we'll start off with you. How important is climate change at Keelings, and what are you guys doing about it?
It's hugely important, Brian. First and foremost, thanks for inviting me to talk to your guests. Listen, Keelings are in the business of growing, and as you can possibly imagine, climate change and growing go hand in hand. And we feel the impact first and foremost, probably, as all growers do. We're at the forefront of that. So it's really important for us to get under the skin of our journey and what we can do to help in our pursuit to be aligned with nicely what we're trying to do both here in Ireland and abroad. So, if you want to talk about our journey on this, we sort of engaged with the likes of yourselves and other people several years ago, saying, well, how do we start this? How do we go about this? And the first thing we done as a business before we talk about Scope 3 was, well, how do we structure this within our organization? We have businesses here in Ireland, with businesses and growing operations, for example, in Costa Rica, packing and growing operations elsewhere around the world. And so how do you bring this together first and foremost to get under the skin of we'll talk about Scope 3, how do we understand Scope 3 emissions? So we formed a framework. In doing so, that allowed us to assess the approach. So we formed pillars within that. Within those pillars, we have people and champions throughout the organization helping us lead those pillars. And obviously climate change is one of those significant pillars. And then when it comes to Scope 3, we'll say, well, the first thing we need to do is, select what's going to be in Scope 3. And at the same time, select a base year, because across our business units, those businesses started different times in their journey. So we had to select a base year, which we did, which was challenging enough, because, as you can imagine, if you're asking somebody in the UK to select their, what they would like as a baseline year, may be slightly different to somebody, one of our other business units elsewhere. But we selected our baseline year, and then we had to get, well, having selected what was going to be in our Scope 3 emissions, how do you measure that? And one of the challenges, as you possibly know, is that the training of our people is really important to help them to understand what we need to do here. So we are looking at that journey with our people and training them. But, we have assessed where we are at this point in time. We've assessed our baseline year, where we've just completed our most recent assessment. We're projecting out what that's likely to be in the year ahead. And then now we're engaging with our supply base. And that's an interesting journey on its own. So how do you go about doing that? So we've opted for the approach, well, let's send them out a survey that they can complete online, that we can then evaluate those responses. And having got those responses, start the journey of engagement with our supply base, because it's only with that engagement, and by the way, with our customers on the other end, that we're going to come up with some of the answers to where we need to be. That's where we are.
Des, thank you. It's a really interesting insight into that journey, and we'll come back on maybe some of those practical steps. So you mentioned one thing about measurement, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Joseph, because I know they've built some really interesting measurement tools on that. But Joseph, Flex you guys are like the Intel inside of most electronic or consumer electronic products. Flex is building products for companies all over the world. I'm sure you're one of the world's, if not the world's largest contract manufacturing firm. So you have your own internal impact. So let me just address first, well, where is sustainability, or where is carbon and climate change at Flex in terms of a topic at the moment? And then maybe just to touch on how are you now looking at this from a supply chain perspective?
Thanks, Brian, and thank you for having me here. So it's one of the easiest questions you can ask. So it's not really to impress, it's more to explain the complexity. We have about 1,000 clients in various industries, be it in health solutions and medical, be it in automotive, in consumer, in infrastructure, cloud, industrial, heavy industrial. So the pressure you would say is more on the consumer, but the pressure is really everywhere. If you exclude automotive, I regard them as the most circular, because as children you would go with your father and they will be searching for a used part. So for us, it's sustainability is so far internally. We have, same as Des explained, we have also 3 pillars. It's environmental, social, and governance. And we have been driving those elements in different speeds, but sincerely since about 20 years. And as a company ourselves, our scope, our internal scopes, we are graded and rated really best in our industry. So we're proud of that. But are we where we want to be? Of course, it's a long work, because we use suppliers, and the suppliers, they have also to be green as possible. So we started looking at the dynamic. We have established our internal processes to measure everything. So towards our clients, when we manufacture or source product, we have set up a tool based on EcoInvest, and we look at environmental metrics, we call it. It's CO2, but it's also water and electricity, and we try to guide the clients through the process. And the motivation is really on the services side. It's extending the life of a product, but circularity is an essential part on the score 3. But the problem is most of the products are not designed for circularity. So there is a motivation and a push, and I would say it would have tripled over COVID time. We see the engagement increasing at a very high speed with the majority of our client. If we look at our interactions with our client currently on the services, and services being forward or reverse, refurbished, asset recovery, all this stuff, I would call 70% of all these activities are around CO2 and how can we help our clients on reducing their footprint. And landfill, zero landfill. So there is a big motivation. We're very excited about that. And the question is how quick we can drive this journey. That's what I keep preaching whenever I have the opportunity. It doesn't matter who you do this with, but just do it as quick as possible. Time is running. So thank you.
Okay, super introduction. I mean, I guess this circular economy, we'll come back to it, because I'm fascinated. Grania's slide, which showed that 75% of Apple's footprint is in their product emissions. That would indicate to me that unless we address product emissions, we'll never hit our scope 3 targets. And circular economy obviously plays a big part in that. So I'll let you come back to you on that. But maybe back to Des, you mentioned something there about engaging with your suppliers, and I'm just interested in that. I mean, so you've got obviously large numbers of suppliers, but I think probably when people look at Keelings, they look at your packaging, and they look at your fruit, they look at your products. So how have you looked at these categories, and have you set targets in terms of reduction of emissions or plastics or anything?
Yeah, well, yeah, we do. We have Brian. We have set a number of targets for our entire business. So as a group, so in terms of climate, it's a 50% reduction in our operational emissions, and we're hoping to do that by 2030. In terms of science-based target, we're hoping to set, at least commit to that next year in 2022.
Right.
And then, and I'm under no illusion, and nor is the business, about how challenging that's going to be. I think it's one thing set the target, next thing delivering on it is going to be a huge challenge. In terms of supplier decarbonisation programs, and again with our supply base, we've committed to doing that. In terms of plastic, yes, we have all our consumer packaging to be 100% recyclable by 2025. And also we'll have a 10% reduction in plastic in terms of intensity by 2025 across all our business units. So we have a lot of targets, that we have set across the business. What was your other part of your question?
I was just saying that obviously you have these targets, you're going to have to start getting your suppliers to come with you. So
yeah, it's an interesting one because, we source from over 40 countries around the world, and each of those suppliers within those regions have their own challenges. And, I say the first part of that process was to write out to them, tell them about what we're trying to do first and foremost. Yeah. And then, with a survey, try and get some feedback about where are they on this carbon journey. And once we get that feedback, and that's only just happened, that's only just recently happened. Once we get that feedback, we then assess then, where first of all, the low hanging fruit, no pun intended, is, and then we work from there onwards. So that's where we are in the journey. And I say, when we assess it, the solutions are not simple, but you have to make the process simple as possible in order to gain traction.
Perfect. Really interesting. And back to that measurement piece. So Joseph, you're probably involved in, let's say, 80% of the emissions for many of these household electronics companies and automotive, and you mentioned a whole range. So what kind of pressure are they putting you under to be able to help them to address their emissions, and what's Flex doing about that?
Well, the interesting thing is that you see a transformation. If you allow me to say, we would have been dealing with pure supply chain people. Now marketing is involved, and most important is sustainability. You have in majority of the companies procurement with the flag sustainability. You don't talk about just the old way, it's about new. So you have to demonstrate everything in terms of CO2 and footprint. So there is this transformation. Now, having a transformation, it slows down the process a bit, but the pressure is completely different. I would say the last 12 months compared to 2 years ago, where it was more talking than doing, and there is a pressure. There is a pressure. Of course, it's if you have a company with a pride product, they have never refurbished it, they have never resold it. It's a big decision for them to refurbish it and resell it. So you have these barriers, but these are temporary. I would say we did not see any showstopper, and there is a demand. Now, the current supply situation is also boosting because you don't have spare parts, you don't have enough products. So the push has really grown significantly the past 3 months. It's about harvesting parts, from return, but also refurbishing and bringing goods, because there is a lack of volumes on the market. So the pressure is really good. Decision making is getting quicker, still not as quick as possible, but we see the pressure growing day by day, that we anticipate a much higher speed in a couple of months.
Okay, so instead of those hard-nosed procurement and supply chain people driving you on price all the time, now you're starting to see the mask about value chain and about sustainability and circular economy. And I think that's only going to accelerate, as you said, the last 12 months. They've all made those commitments in terms of science-based targets and net zero. So you're right in that sweet zone to be able to help them to do that and to measure. I think your tools are really interesting because that helps them. That's the evidence. That's exactly the evidence of that scope 3 and carbon reduction impact. So really interesting. Des, in terms of, if you were to give, we're getting towards the end, but if you were to give advice, I mean, obviously this is a journey. A number of people have said that. Keelings has been ambitious. I think you've acknowledged there's lots of stuff that you're starting in your way. But if you were to advise somebody who hasn't started that journey now, What would you say are the key things that as a buyer, as somebody looking at your scope 3 emissions, what are the key things that you would advise them to do?
Specifically around scope 3, Brian?
Specifically around scope 3 and their supply chain, yeah, and your supply chain.
First and foremost, you know, you have to select first what you want to, you know, have in your scope 3 emissions as a starting point. From there, good data is really important. If you're going to make decisions about how you're going to approach this going forward, the consistency of the information that you're analyzing is really, really important. And you need, you know, first and foremost, you also need to do that analysis. You need to calculate your emissions. You know, try and build up a, you know, an inventory of your greenhouse gas emissions, and then move forward from there. But you have to engage with your supply base. And, you know, I talked about plastic earlier on, and I know it's just slightly off topic, but, you know, we're working with manufacturers who see that, you know, if they don't reduce, you know, and these are people who sell plastic, for example, for a living in Punnett, whatever, and they do, if they don't see the future, then how do you resolve the problem with them? So it's really important, you know, that you do the assessment, you do the calculation, and also train your people, because people you're going to task with delivering some of this stuff will need upskilled.
It's a really good point that you made there about the engagement process, because I think we have, you know, within our control, scope 1 and scope 2, we can largely, you know, we can largely make those decisions ourselves in terms of investment in renewables, in terms of purchasing green electricity, in terms of reducing our usage. But scope 3, it's this influence and engagement zone, whether it's through circular economy practices. So you've been really interested. You're absolutely right, and I think, you know, companies start that journey with the measure and understanding that scope 3 screening that Grania talked about, but then the engagement piece becomes critical. And I think that's where Hugo and the tools that he presented to us today, I think, will be a very important part, because I think when people get past that first initial doing their own assessments, then they'll want to dig into the data. You mentioned data, they'll want to understand that a bit more. So very useful. So in terms of last, I mean, obviously you've made those commitments now, and you're, I think you said you're looking towards setting your own targets and engaging with the suppliers. I mean, is there a challenge? Is there anything in that you're having to battle, or is it, you know, pretty headwinds? You've got it sorted.
Is this to me again, Brian?
Yeah, sorry, Les. Yeah, last.
Sorry, apologies. I wish we had it sorted. I think the complexity of scope 3 emissions means that you're on that journey forever to a large extent. From our perspective, let's, you know, engaging with our suppliers is really where the magic's going to happen.
Perfect. And
that's our focus right now, to engage with our supply base and deliver something that's sustainable long term.
Excellent. And I should have mentioned that Keelings has also decided itself, obviously, to disclose. You're not publicly quoted, so you made that to report yourself. And I should have mentioned also, Joseph, going back to yourself, I believe Flex is an A-listed company, or certainly you're in that A category. So you're obviously walking the talk. But I guess the same question to you about now, if you would advise, so you see you're out there, you're engaging with customers. How are you gearing up now to being the lower supply chain, the lower scope 3 emissions organization for your customers?
Well, it's the nice thing about measuring, it's you're driving fact-based. So and that's always the surprise you see on the faces when we're talking to client. When we design any solution, it's always, we took it now for standard, looking, you know, dollars and cents are very important, but CO2 and the whole environmental metrics is part of it. So it's practically the same surprise. Oh my God, this is what I can do. And the engagement and the push is, guys, it doesn't cost money if you are always able to make money with circular economy. Just step up and start looking at the options. So but we love it that we are able to measure. If you don't know where you are, you cannot do anything. So measurement was really the key changer for us. being able to measure all the activities. Sorry, go ahead.
I love that point about the cost, because we often get told, oh, this is more expensive, but the reality, and you're feeling it, is that if you plan this well ahead at the suppliers, then you're actually taking cost out. It's that systemic change, and I think that's what also makes it so hard with Scope 3. Is it's that interface. There's overlaps. You know, one person's Scope 3 is another person's Scope 1 or Scope 2. So that interdependence. So lovely, it provides a great opportunity for you to engage with your clients. So sounds like Flex is really moving forward and well ahead of the pack in terms of being able to measure and disclose emissions for your customers. So thank you very much, Joseph. Thanks very much, Des, and for your insight. I mean, I would say the guys are, you know, showing us that there's different ways to approach this and be brave and engage with suppliers and engage with customers. So finally, just to say thank you. Thanks to Des and Joseph. Thanks to Alwyn, Hugo, and Muriel, who's always in the background helping us as well with all our questions at CDP headquarters. Thank you to the Clearstream team who helped me put this together, in particular Grania, who presented as usual her expertise on all these Scope 3 emissions and other emissions. And finally, just to mention that we have an event as part of Climate Finance Week coming up on ESG and climate reporting. That's on Wednesday, the 13th of August. So keep an eye on your emails, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.